We're recording. So again, thanks for being here. Following today's information session, we'll be holding a series of discussions over the coming months during our work group and state calls to craft the coalition's priorities for the 2023 Farm Bill. Today, we will be hearing from Harry Huntley, who is the Senior Ag Policy Analyst at the Environmental Policy Innovation Center. Thank you, Harry, for being with us today, and we look forward to learning more about the Farm Bill from you. So please take it away. I'm going to spotlight you real quick. Here you go.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah. I am happy to be here. And as always, I'm happy to be in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. I'm a little bit farther away from it today. I'm in our DC office, not in my normal home in Annapolis. But yes, as Sarah said, I'm going to be talking today about opportunities for clean water in the 2023 Farm Bill. And of course, to understand where the opportunities are, we're a big believer you got to understand the whole system and understand where the problems are before you can start finding the solution. So we're going to really dive into some of the origins of the Farm Bill and what it actually means. And then eventually we will get to the opportunities. And I, maybe a little bit, and probably more Sarah, will tell you about how Choose Clean Water Coalition is going to go about actually advocating for their priorities. So first, a little bit about my organization. I work at the Environmental Policy Innovation Center. My job specifically is to help governments build policies to better pay farmers who improve water quality. But EPIC's mission, in a word, is speed. We are laser focused on dramatically increasing the speed and scale of conservation in this country, especially around water, which I know is something that is near and dear to all of your hearts. So first, let's look at the Chesapeake Bay to understand why this is so important. I pulled this slide the other day from Ann Swanson's presentation to the Chesapeake Executive Council meeting, because I thought it really shows where we've come, where we are, and then the obvious where we need to go. And what you can see here is that in the past 40-ish years, Chesapeake Bay has made tremendous strides, and agriculture even has made tremendous strides. But agriculture is still the biggest contributor to Chesapeake Bay degradation, particularly around nitrogen, which is what this chart is showing. And so you can see that there's still 42 million, 40-ish million pounds of nitrogen that we need to eliminate from going to the Chesapeake every year to get to that 2025 target. And agriculture is really the obvious place to do that. And it's not just me saying that. You have lots of people recognize this challenge. This is a quote from the executive director of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, Hillary Hart Fox. She says, "Addressing these challenges," meaning agricultural runoff, "is the defining challenge of the current partnership." And I agree. And this other stat really struck me. In Pennsylvania, 90% of the state's remaining pollution reductions need to come from its farms. 90%. So everything else that we're talking about it's kind of just small potatoes when you have this big elephant in the room that is agricultural pollution. And I know all of you put lots of time and effort into thinking about how do we address this. But the fact is, it's just expensive. And I spend all day thinking about how to make it a little bit less expensive. But the fact is, it's going to cost a lot of money. One estimate from 2014 found that between 2010 and 2025, it would cost $3.6 billion to meet the 2025 deadline goal for agriculture. And then that it would cost another almost $1 billion per year to keep us there, which is really just some staggering numbers. $3.6 billion, which is crazy. So the question is, where's that money going to come from? Frankly, it's probably not going to come out of farmers' pockets. That's just the political reality of things. Maybe we can find opportunities for wastewater to pay for it some. Maybe there will be state level funding opportunities, but that's a lot of money for states to contribute. And especially when we know that the majority of these agricultural best management practices need to be implemented in Pennsylvania, which is a state that's really historically been reticent to offer up funding opportunities, even for their own farmers. But luckily, there is a big pot of money from the feds that can maybe almost address that number. So this is the funding for the 2018 Farm Bill, which lays out money from FY 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022, and 2023, which is why next year we're going to be talking about the 2023 Farm Bill, or really we're talking about it right now already. There's a couple of things I want you to notice about this chart. The most obvious is that the vast majority of the money goes to the nutrition title, especially the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which has historically been called food stamps. And that is incredibly important. And the ethos behind the Farm Bill, which I'll get into a little bit more later, it's really that you're marrying the interest of very rural constituents who grow the food and more urban constituents, which of course makes up the majority of the population in the United States, who consume the food. Although it's also worth noting that while that's sort of how it's thought about, in fact, food insecurity is generally, or food deserts are generally more prevalent in rural areas. So that's kind of like the mythology behind the Farm Bill, but it's not entirely accurate. Nevertheless, it's created a durable political coalition. A couple other things to note. The commodities title, we're not really going to talk about too much, but the second biggest part is crop insurance. And crop insurance represents generally one of the biggest subsidies to agriculture. And it can get very, very wonky very, very quickly. So we won't dive into it too much, but I do want to just touch on a couple things about crop insurance, which are that it is generally geared towards less diversified farms. And then there are a couple of requirements you have to meet. They're called conservation compliance that if you do not meet them, make you ineligible for all of this money, including crop insurance, which is a really big loss for farmers. So those couple of conservation compliances, which we generally don't have a terribly hard time meeting in at least Maryland, and I think the Chesapeake Bay more broadly, are important, and farmers are really incentivized to meet them. But the bulk of what we're going to be talking about here is the conservation title. And I'll get into that more in a couple of slides. So first, how did this come about? Well, a lot of people like to think that it really started with the Depression, but I kind of think that it started actually a little bit before that. I would trace the origins of the Farm Bill to World War I, where with Europe really destroyed, the US stepped up its grain production. And so even before what we think of as like the great stock market crash in 1929 and the Great Depression, the farm economy was already in crisis because they had this huge glut of wheat that they had been producing to feed armies and to make up for the lost production in Europe. And suddenly, as all the people, the armies didn't need food and production ramped up in Europe, there was this huge oversupply of wheat in particular, but lots of commodities, which drove down their prices and caused farms to go out of business. At the same time, you're seeing an ecological change, partially due to farming, that created the Dust Bowl, which you can see this picture of here. So I had to include this picture in the bottom left, which is of the then Senate Agriculture Chairman. I think this is actually from 1937 or 38, but with my all-time favorite Secretary of Agriculture, Henry Aggard Wallace, who his father, Henry Cantwell Wallace, was a Republican Secretary of Agriculture. Wallace was a known newspaperman. He was a corn breeder, chicken breeder, had his hands in just about everything agriculture related. And FDR asked him to come and join the administration as his agriculture secretary. He did probably more for farmers than just about anybody else in this country. And I will happily debate that if anybody wants to talk about it. So he was really the impetus behind a lot of this. So they passed the first Farm Bill, which was really meant to address this farm crisis. It was much more economically focused in 1933, and then added soil conservation as the Dust Bowl worsened. And then in 1973, as part of FDR's Great Society and War on Poverty, that's when the food assistance part was added, which was a really critical critical component, and has since created that coalition that I was talking about. We're going to go back. And then the beginning of our modern conservation title, when it was added as its own section, was in 1981. And just to reiterate, you guys can see that the Farm Bill gets renewed about every 5 years. There have been 18 farm bills, and I saw a question in the chat about the cost. All of those numbers were for 5 years. And you can see right down here that the total cost of the Farm Bill is $428 billion over 5 years. So before we go any further, before I get into any more details, I need to give a disclaimer, which is that frequently I have to go back and look at things on this because it is incredibly complicated. We're only really talking about the conservation title here, and it still gets incredibly complicated. So if you have questions, please, I implore you to go to crsreports.congress.gov. Everything you'd ever want to know about the Farm Bill just about is included in these CRS reports. And that's the Congressional Research Service. They put out reports based on each title, sometimes even based on each program. They'll talk about what changed between Farm Bill in 2014 and 2018. They'll talk about what issues are emerging for future ones. So I can't plug them enough. The Congressional Research Service is a wonderful resource. If you have any questions, particularly ones that I can't answer today, definitely check out crsreports.congress.gov. And we're back to the funding. So the conservation title has over 5 years, $29.6 billion in funding. So it works out to be about $6 billion per year over 5 years. Now, a quick aside, sometimes you'll see the Farm Bill talked about over 10 years. And that's because the Congressional Budget Office scores all bills over 10 years, or just about all bills. And so just anytime you see it over 10 years, like kind of disregard it. You really only care about the first 5 years because you can know it's going to be replaced in 5 years. So let's dive into what that $29.6 billion goes to. Well, first off, the USDA will kind of divide it into two big categories: working land and land retirement. And then you can see there's two others here as well. Working land and land retirement are very much what it sounds like. The big land retirement program is CRP, a Conservation Reserve Program, which we'll get into a little bit. And then working land means actually implementing practices on lands that are being farmed. So land retirement would be like taking some land out of farming and making it into grassland or forest or something like that. And then easements, you probably all know pretty well because these are common in the Chesapeake Bay region. They are a legally binding agreement that says this property cannot be developed. You are selling away your development rights to the federal government, the state government, a nonprofit. And then partnership and grant, that's just kind of an all-encompassing term. What that really is talking about is the RCPP program, but we'll get into the details of that. We're not going to spend too much time on this slide. This is obviously a lot. And just to show that there are a lot of programs here, we can really get into the weeds if we want to. If any of you have questions, I will do my best. But we're really going to focus today on what are called the Big Five, which are ASEP, or the Agriculture Conservation Easement Program, the Conservation Reserve Program, or CRP, the Conservation Stewardship Program, CSP, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. If you only remember one, that's probably the most important, and the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. So let's jump right in. The Conservation Reserve Program is really a pretty big one, but it is land retirement. It is converting marginal cropland to grasslands, to woodlands through these 10 to 15 year contracts. So not forever. It's not like you're putting an easement on it, but you are saying for a pretty significant amount of time, I'm going to take this land out of production. And it's generally focused more on a whole field. You wouldn't just like do like a corner necessarily, although there are some programs for it. A lot of these have sub programs. So you might hear me make generalizations about what CRP typically funds, but there might be some little set asides within it that may contradict that. And as you can see, there's currently 21 million acres enrolled in CRP. There was a bit of a kerfuffle around CRP earlier this year because some, I think mostly on the right side of the aisle, were agitating that farmers should be allowed to break these contracts to produce more grain given the war in Ukraine, which has really strained global grain, particularly wheat production. And so there was some talk that maybe we should let folks take this out of CRP. I think that mostly didn't happen. I think it's mostly gotten beat back for now. But really the debate when we're talking about these working land programs versus land retirement programs is essentially like, how much do we want to have more farmers versus more farms versus how much do we want to take land out of production? And frankly, for waterways, a lot of the times the best thing is to take the land out of production. But of course, food security is good. Producing food is good. And generally people want to defend the sort of farm way of life. So you'll see a lot of discussion around how much should we put towards land retirement versus working lands. I just saw today American Farm Bureau Federation put out their Farm Bill priorities, and I haven't dug into it all that much. But one thing I did notice is they have real headline on the conservation title: we support working land programs over land retirement programs. You can imagine that's something that Farm Bureau would prefer. ASEP is the big agricultural easement program, and there are two parts to it: the ALE, or the Agriculture Land Easement Program, and WRE, the Wetland Reserve Easement, I think, or enhancement, something like that. And these are two pretty darn different programs, but really they do the same thing, which is say what's there right now is going to be there forever, be it a wetland or be it ag land. And a lot of farmers are pretty excited about this ALE, the Agriculture Easement Program, because what it does is pay them a chunk of money up front or give them a tax break for a couple of years, depending on how it's structured, to just say that my farm is going to be a farm forever. And that can be a real point of pride among farmers. And as we're talking about the Chesapeake Bay, you saw in that very first graph that even though ag is a big problem, that has actually gone down, the nitrogen from agriculture. Whereas the only category I think that has gone up was from urban runoff. And so really it's like suburban and urban runoff because of sprawl. So it really is good for the Chesapeake Bay to preserve these farms, even though we talk about the issues with agriculture. It's better they be a farm than be a parking lot. And the wetland reserve is in many ways very similar. Just you say you're going to keep that land in a wetland forever. This is kind of cool. Just this is a picture of a farm in Pennsylvania that has been preserved forever. Like I said, I know a handful of farmers who are really proud of the fact that they can say my farm should be a farm forever. And it's something that they want to be able to pass down to their kids, to future generations, to make sure it's not some gross condominium. So it's a real point of pride. These are the two big working lands programs. Again, there's a zillion farm bill programs. You could get yourself spun up in knots trying to understand every last one, but these top five are what we really want to focus on. And EQIP, as I mentioned before, is probably the most important. It's $1.8 billion a year that gives cost share contracts to practices and to structures. And it is not necessarily on a whole farm basis, it's more field by field compared to CSP. So in Maryland, of course, we have our cover crop program that we're really proud of, but if you're a farmer in, say, New York, you might get a contract from EQIP to plant cover crops. And the way that will work is that you go out, you buy some seed, you go back to the federal government, you say, this seed cost me, I don't know, let's just make it up, $100. The federal government might pay you $50 back. So that's what cost share means, if you haven't heard that term before. It's they are paying part of the cost. And really it's, I think this is kind of important. It sounds like maybe they're just going to give you the money up front, but no, you have to pay up front for these cost share programs. There are some things like in EQIP where historically underserved farmers can get a percentage up front, but again, it's you got to go out, you got to buy the seed, and then the federal government will reimburse you if you have one of these EQIP contracts. CSP in many ways is kind of the same idea. It's helping put conservation practices onto working lands, but with using cost share. But it's much more systems focused and more whole farm focused rather than being field by field, structure by structure like EQIP is. And my understanding is it tends to be lower payments, which seems kind of weird, but right, like you would think there's a benefit to having a whole system, and so you would want to pay farmers more for that. But I think that's more of a political consideration, that are some folks who don't like CSP as much because they feel like it's too controlling, and so there's less money to go around. An important thing to note about these programs is that they are way oversubscribed. EQIP frequently can only fund a quarter to a third of the applications it receives. And this is a farm up in Carroll County that receives some EQIP funds to be able to fence livestock out of the stream. You can see in the left-hand side picture, the livestock were walking, I think it was cows, walking right through this stream. They're getting it all muddy. It's a real mess. And it looks like there's a fence there, but in reality, the cows were just going right through it. And so on the right-hand side, you can see how just by putting up a fence so that land could be more natural, it's really dramatically improved. I think you can just tell by looking at it, the water quality, but also created a lot of natural habitat for pollinators, for generally kinds of biodiversity, insects, birds, etc. Now, this is maybe my favorite one, RCPP, or the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. You'll hear people talk about Farm Bill alphabet soup because all of these programs have acronyms, and it can get a little bit hairy, especially because sometimes there will be two programs that have the same acronym. There's CSP, the Conservation Stewardship Program I was just talking about, and then there's another CSP also in the Farm Bill. So it can get very confusing. But RCPP is a program that's really focused on partnerships. It's really focused on, you can submit an application, and you meaning a nonprofit, so probably a lot of you on this call would be eligible to submit a RCPP application, and you can get a you have to provide some kind of match, either you or a state or local government partner. But once you have that match, then the federal government will come in and they will provide money for, this is critical, any of those previous practices. So anything that's eligible under EQIP or CSP or CRP or ASAP, you can do with this money. And it's really a way for partners to bring additional money to the federal government's money. It's also a way for partners on the ground who know farmers well to be trusted and bring the programs to them, rather than the farmers having to run out and go to the NRCS office and figure it all out themselves. And there's a couple of critical things I want to mention about RCPP. The first being critical conservation areas. Half of RCPP funds are earmarked for what are called critical conservation areas, as defined by the Natural Resource Conservation Service. And luckily, the Chesapeake Bay watershed is one of those critical conservation areas. Now, honestly, the whole thing is defined pretty broadly. So like maybe more than half the country is a critical conservation area, but it does still give the Chesapeake Bay region a leg up in applying for these grants. And then one last thing I want to touch on, and I'll try to keep it relatively simple. Most of the time, RCPP works that you as a partner go out, you talk to the farmers, you get them to, I don't know, let's say put an easement on their land, and then they go through NRCS to actually get the money to do that. Recently, in the last 2018 Farm Bill, something called an alternative financial arrangement was authorized, and that allows the money to flow, instead of from NRCS to the farmer, it goes from NRCS to the partner and then to the farmer. So that, which kind of sounds more convoluted, but in practice is actually typically a lot easier because the partners are already working with the farmers. So for the farmers, it's one less layer of bureaucracy they have to deal with. Excuse me. And then another critical part of the Farm Bill is conservation technical assistance. So this is actually what makes it possible for NRCS staff to get all these projects done. And the way that NRCS thinks about technical assistance is in two sides of it. There's enhancement and there's implementation. So implementation technical assistance is really like planning, design. Probably what these two guys are doing right here would be implementation technical assistance. So if you're a farmer, you walk into your local NRCS office and you say, I want to put in, I don't know, let's say terraces. They'll work with you to design those terraces, figure out where on your field that you want them, figure out what equipment you might need, and actually draw up plans. Whereas enhancement technical assistance is much more what it says right on the screen, outreach and education. It's talking with farmers, getting them to do these plans. It's maybe the local land grant university just realized there's some great new conservation practice and NRCS puts on a webinar to teach farmers about it. That would be enhancement technical assistance. Unlike the programs we talked about before, which are mandated their funding in the Farm Bill. So I'll talk about it on the next slide, but just off the top of my head, our CPP is $300 million a year. That says in the Farm Bill, Congress shall give $300 million a year to our CPP. The conservation technical assistance is a little bit different because it is authorized. So authorization is kind of like spelling out what the money can be used for, but not actually giving the money. It's like your mom giving you the shopping list, but not giving you the cash yet. And so that actual money being appropriated happens through the annual appropriations process. $760 million a year is nothing to sneeze at. That's a significant chunk of money, but technical assistance and especially implementation technical assistance is frequently a bottleneck for projects. A farmer might want to do something, but it takes them a long time of dealing with understaffed NRCS offices to actually get the project designed and then even more completed. So there's a real need for more technical assistance. Oh, what do you know? There's an extra $1 billion for conservation technical assistance through the recently passed Inflation Reduction Act, which actually adds lots more money to the Farm Bill. So we talked about 5 programs earlier. The only one that's not on here is CSP, Conservation Stewardship Program. I'm sorry, CRP. The only one that's not on here is CRP, Conservation Reserve Program. See, I told you those acronyms can be tricky. But each one of the programs that I talked about besides CRP are getting huge infusions of cash. Regional Conservation Partnership Program, $300 million a year program. This money is now in addition to that $300 million a year or whatever it is in the next Farm Bill. So by FY 2026, our Regional Conservation Partnership Program is going to go from a $300 million a year program to a $2.7 billion a year program. And that is going to require some significant scaling up by NRCS. We need to think about not just, it's great that this money is here, but actually how do we get the money out the door? And I mentioned earlier that, yeah, there is a big bottleneck or that there is a oversubscription, especially to CSP, to EQIP. And so this money is expected to help with that, but also the technical assistance is a really big part of it. If there's not enough money for technical assistance, then this money, what they call financial assistance, what actually pays farmers to do the things, is not really going to be that helpful if we can't get it out the door because we can't get the projects designed. So we need to be thinking not just about, hey, it's great we have all this money, but how do we actually spend it? And one thing I want to make sure I note also about all this IRA money is it is very much focused on climate change. It's focused on improving soil carbon, reducing nitrogen losses, reducing, capturing, avoiding, and sequestering carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide emissions associated with agricultural production. Now, this is interesting. The money is clearly earmarked with the intent that it be focused on climate change. We're here talking about water. Of course, there are some interactions, but I think this reduced nitrogen losses is really fascinating because my read is that Congress probably meant it as nitrogen losses to the air because nitrogen can be a potent greenhouse gas, but it doesn't specify. And so my hope is that these funds can still be used for reducing nitrogen runoff, like in the Chesapeake Bay region. And I'm seeing we have some questions in the chat. So before I jump in, maybe Sarah, do you want to read those to me?
Yeah, we have a question from Michael. Is the Conservation Reserve Program getting IRA money as well?
Michael, no, the Conservation Reserve Program is not getting IRA money. And sorry, if I had to guess, that is due to the influence of farm organizations that much prefer working lands programs to land retirement programs.
And we have another question about RCPP and does it subsidize CAFOs?
Interesting question. It could. So these, the practices that CSP and EQIP can fund do include practices that would potentially go to animal feeding operations, including CAFOs. Here's a critical thing here that I was going to get to a little bit later, but interestingly enough, EQIP actually has a 50% set aside for livestock. 50% of, going back, these EQIP funds, that $1.8 billion a year, have to go to livestock programs. And we think that's probably bad because I'm speaking here in my capacity as a co-chair of the Clean Water for All Nutrient Pollution Coalition, but we think that is probably bad because it is subsidizing CAFOs. There are a couple different ways you could maybe try and change that. Like it'd be amazing if we could just say CAFOs can't get any farm bill money, but that's tricky for a couple of reasons I could get into if we want to. But we think one really good way to go about it is just remove that restriction, remove that requirement that 50% of EQIP money go to at livestock. And luckily, in the IRA money, that requirement is gone. So we're looking at that $3.45 billion that does not have that requirement that 50% go to livestock. And this is crazy. I was shocked by this, but I had a meeting with the staff for the House Ag Committee, the ranking members side. And I said to him that we should maybe get rid of that set aside. And I was sure he was going to shut it down. And they said, no, actually in the last farm bill, the House version actually did get rid of that set aside. And the Senate did not want that gone. So I'll have to dig in a little bit more and see why that is, why the Senate wanted to keep it. But I hope that answered your question.
The next question is, how might our nonprofit help recruit and train technical assistants?
That is a good question. It's maybe a little bit outside the scope of the Farm Bill, but you can definitely get regional conservation partnership money for technical assistance. And there's a limit, I want to say maybe it's 15% of the money can be used for technical assistance and the rest should be used for financial assistance. But it is possible to get a waiver for that. So I would say you can do it outside of the Farm Bill structure. That might be more effective. But if you really wanted to do technical assistance within the Farm Bill structure, Regional Conservation Partnership Program is probably the way to go.
And are there forest carbon credits?
Are there forest carbon credits? No.
Okay.
I am hesitant to talk too much about this because we're getting outside the realm of what I feel super confident in. But maybe we can go back to that one at the end if you want to follow up with a more specific question about the forest carbon credits.
And then we have two more. Is there any Farm Bill money dedicated to implementing blue carbon practices?
I am not aware of any. That is not to say that there is not.
And then last one, is there an opportunity to carve out funds for disadvantaged and or historically underserved producers to help address inequities and steer away some from industrial scale CAFOs?
Yeah, I'm going to put the CAFO part of that to the side, but the answer to your question is absolutely. And in fact, the Inflation Reduction Act did just that. USDA created a program that basically was exactly what you're describing. It was saying like historically underserved producers, which is a very distinctly controlled term by USDA and is actually separate from disadvantaged producers. It's a little bit more broad. This money would go specifically, I think that was actually to disadvantaged producers. And basically it was going to get challenged in court. And then in the Inflation Reduction Act, they put in some provisions that made it acceptable to the courts. But at the expense, basically they made it a little bit more race blind, but in a way that was still going to provide substantial benefits to disadvantaged communities. I don't know all of the details on that, but I would love to talk more about it, either with you or with anybody who knows a little bit more about it, because I think it's a really interesting avenue pursue. It's certainly an important one.
We did have one more question come up.
I just keep seeing the number increase.
Does CSP also subsidize CAFOs?
The practices can. I think maybe it'd be a little bit harder to do because it's whole farm. I don't think that CSP has that 50% livestock set aside. We good to move on, Sarah?
That was the last question for now.
All right, we'll see. Okay, so we got into what the Farm Bill is, and now we're going to talk a little bit about what's the political process of it. So I don't know if Peter's on the call today, but I heard Peter a month or so ago now, looked into he used the 538 model to see if what the percentage chance was of the Democrats retaking the House, the Republicans retaking the House, etc. And I love 538's model, but I thought I would just show a different way of looking at this, which is from a website called Predict It, where folks can actually bet on who they think is going to have control. And that right now puts Republican House and Senate at the most likely chance. Excuse me. And with Republican House and Democratic Senate being also quite likely, seems like really slim chance that there will be a Democratic House and Senate. So as we're crafting these priorities, we really need to be thinking about what are Republicans going to want, what are the watchwords for them. And I'll get into that a little bit more in a second. But I do want to make sure we go over the process, which has already begun. I mean, obviously we're having these conversations right here, but on Capitol Hill, the process began months ago, starting with hearings. So they're having hearings on everything under the sun, both different titles, different provisions within titles, different areas of the country. And I'd say the House has been a little bit more active than the Senate on this, but the ag committees in both chambers are having these hearings right now. And they'll invite some people who knows about them. They might invite people who are directly affected, like a cattle rancher or something. And they'll get to talk a little bit about what is important to them in the Farm Bill, and also to hear from the committee members what some of their priorities are. And it's also a chance for them truly to get informed about this and really ask questions, dig into the meat of it. Simultaneously, and maybe even before, is the introduction of what's called marker bills, right? So the Farm Bill is one big bill, gets passed as one thing, but there are going to be lots of little bills that get introduced kind of with the goal of laying down a marker. So an example of this is called the Ag Resilience Act by Congresswoman Shelley Pingree. You can take a look at it if you want, but it's basically a bill that she introduced as a standalone with the intent of getting many of those provisions into the Farm Bill. And once you have that actual bill introduced, then there's clear language that you can just kind of copy and paste later. And you can work to get more co-sponsors. You can get build momentum with outside groups. So having those marker bills is both really important for the folks on the Hill to get their priorities passed, but it's also something that we all need to be paying attention to because many of them have already been introduced. In fact, maybe most of them. And so it gives you a sense of who has what priorities and how do you speak their language. If I know that Congressman Thompson here, who's the ranking member on the House Ag Committee, if I know that he's already co-sponsored a marker bill that's called the Farmer Driven Conservation Outcomes Act, well, I know when I go talk to Congressman Thompson or his staff that I want to be talking about conservation outcomes and making sure that that is very farmer focused as well. And then, of course, the very first work will be done by the agriculture committees themselves. They will start drafting it. The staff maybe have already started drafting some parts. And that's done. Actually, they probably haven't started drafting it yet because they're all kind of waiting to see how the election turns out. But that's literally like staff sitting down at a desk and writing, and some help from legislative counsel. But I want to make sure you all know who the key players are here. You got David Scott of Georgia, who's up in our top left here. He's the current chair of the House Ag Committee, and the ranking member is Glenn Thompson, or GT Thompson, of Pennsylvania. The bottom left, you have Debbie Stabenow, the chair of the Senate Ag Committee, and the ranking member, John Boozman of Arkansas, who is the ranking member of the Senate Ag Committee. Ranking member, if you're not aware, just means that they're the highest ranking of the minority party on that committee. So Stabenow and Scott, both Democrats, Thompson and Bozeman or Boozman, I never know how to say his name, both Republicans. So the committees write it. Then they'll start having what's called markups, which are where they actually bring in the members of the committee, and they will have kind of like hearings, but where they're actually doing work editing the bill. And then eventually, once the Ag Committee passes it, we'll go to a full vote in each chamber. Typically what happens is the Senate and the House will pass their own versions. So they'll each have a full vote on the House or Senate floor. And those versions end up being different, sometimes very dramatically. In 2018, even though both chambers were controlled by Republicans, they were very different bills that came out of them. And so they have what's called a conference committee where the staff and then eventually the principals come together and they, argue it out and figure out, okay, we'll keep your part of the Senate bill if we get to keep our part of the House bill, that sort of thing. And then of course it's signed by the president. So who do we need to be paying attention to? Well, certainly those chairs are ranking members, especially the ranking members, as I just mentioned, but also might want to think about what members are in the watershed. But unfortunately, the pickings are kind of slim here. To my knowledge, at least, we only have 3 members of the Ag committees in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, which are Kirsten Gillibrand from New York. Of course, New York is not a super Bay focused state. They only have a relatively small portion of the watershed. Gillibrand's focus on the Ag Committee has mostly been around nutrition and around dairy, which of course is a big industry in New York. So maybe a champion, maybe not. Abigail Spanberger, Democrat from Virginia. She's potentially, I think, maybe one of our best opportunities to really be a champion for the Chesapeake Bay and for clean water. And then she's in a pretty competitive district, I think, in Virginia. So fingers crossed she makes it. I haven't looked at the recent polling for her. And then, of course, our friend here on the right, Congressman G.T. Thompson, who is from Pennsylvania, right in heavy ag country, kind of western, middle-ish Pennsylvania. And he really is aware of water quality issues. I mean, he's a Republican, but it is something that he thinks about. And he, I know, has gone to some farm tours, seen how these practices can help, but he's very focused on making sure that they are farmer-driven, and also is kind of whatever the opposite of a tax and spend liberal is. That's what he is. He's very focused on cost cutting. So some things that I've been hearing and some of the meetings I've been having with staff are making sure these programs are farmer focused, making sure that on the Republican side that we're not getting too overwhelmed by the ballooning cost of the nutrition title. And also there are always hawks on conservation spending. So this is in many ways the meat of the presentation. What are we going to do with all this information? Well, you can draw your own conclusions. I know the Choose Clean Water Coalition is going to figure out what they want to prioritize, but this is just me shooting at some options, opportunities, ideas, whatever you want to call them. These are some things that we could potentially do with the Farm Bill to improve clean water. First of all is increasing conservation funding levels. Now, I know I just told you our CPP is about to get a 9 times increase. Many of these programs are getting huge shots in the arm from the Inflation Reduction Act. But our nutrient pollution challenge is getting worse. So, and we already weren't addressing the problem. As I said, yeah, we have this huge backlog. We're getting only 25-30% of applications being funded. So hopefully the Inflation Reduction Act money can fix the backlog, and then we can have more money in the conservation title to make sure we don't get to that backlog again. A bit of a politics point here is that there's definitely some pushback on increasing conservation funding, but I think it is a stronger point if you come in and say we want to increase it rather than just saying, hey, please don't cut it anymore. You're coming off on a stronger foot there. So that's just my opinion on how to frame it. I know in the Bay region, the Chesapeake Bay the invasive blue catfish has been a big problem in the Chesapeake Bay. Right now, catfish harvesting and processing, or the processing, not the harvesting, the processing is regulated by the US Department of Agriculture, which is an anomaly because that is the only fish they regulate. Every other fish processing is regulated by the Food and Drug Administration. And sure enough, that has caused significant problems in the ability of watermen in the Chesapeake Bay to catch or to process blue catfish, and thus they don't have a market when they catch them. Modernizing crop insurance, there's a lot of different things to be done with that. Crop insurance is a really big draw for farmers. And so any kind of tweaks you can make to make it a little bit better could have really big impacts. One thing that I've been talking about is a discount for farmers that have better soil health or more carbon in their soils, which of course leads to both more resilient farms, so they're less likely to need crop insurance, but also is really good for waterways because you can have more infiltration and less erosion. Speeding up RCPP, really all of these programs I talked about the need to get money out the door, but RCPP in particular is disastrously slow, and it's getting a really huge increase in their funding. So there's a lot of things that need to be done to speed up RCPP. If anybody wants to get in the weeds on that, I'd love to talk about it. I'm going to skip watershed partnerships just in the interest of time. Somebody asked earlier about how do we make sure that we support disadvantaged farmers, especially given USDA's history of outright racism to them. And the answer is I don't have an answer. I don't have something that I have said like, here's this perfect program that would fix all of it. But I think we need to be looking at all of our programs through the lens of, will this increase equity or decrease it? And a lot of these programs are targeted to larger farms and more industrial farms. And so we need to be taking a program by program approach to look at how can we increase equity, increase environmental justice in every one of these programs. And then this is my real hobby horse, prioritizing water quality outcomes, which I think we can do through I see two big opportunities. One is the Farmer-Driven Conservation Outcomes Act. This was introduced by a coalition of bipartisan lawmakers. I know PASA, the Pennsylvania Alliance for Sustainable Agriculture, which I think is a coalition member, that they were really instrumental in this. But basically what it does is make it so USDA can actually measure the outcomes of all this conservation funding that's going out. So they can know how many pounds of nitrogen are getting prevented from flowing into Chesapeake Bay by each equip dollar. Seems like really common sense stuff, but they can't currently, and it would be good if they could. And then the other thing is a clean water outcomes matching program. So in Maryland, we are now directly buying this at the state level, directly buying nitrogen reduction outcomes. We're not just doing the cost share that I described earlier, but when farms can prove that they have reduced their nitrogen output into rivers and streams, we're paying them for that on a pound for pound basis. And this is a really exciting idea. I think Maryland is pioneering. Pennsylvania is now taking it up, and we'll hopefully have one set up soon. But more and more states can do this across the country. So we think it'd be a really good idea to just match money that state programs commit. This is a way to get more money in farmers' pockets and to increase the effectiveness of the dollars that we're spending. So I can talk your ear off. I can give a whole webinar just about this, but I think having a fund that will match state programs dedicated to purchasing water quality outcomes would be huge. So when is all this going to happen for you guys? Well, obviously today we're doing our webinar. And then I know the coalition in November 22 is November, so next month is going to start discussions around their priorities and have that solidified by next February, when they can go, you all can go out to Choose Clean Water Coalition's lobby day on Capitol Hill and really be able to talk about these, say, why do these matter to farmers in our watershed and to farmers and to the Chesapeake Bay. And hopefully with all that done, by the time we're writing the next farm bill, the chart will look like this. And we'll actually be meeting these goals. Maybe we'll even be going above them. And it will be because we valued our farmers and because we've worked with them and helped them get to the target that we know the Bay needs. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Harry. We do have two more questions in the chat. What is the likelihood that some of the IRA conservation funding gets redirected or clawed back? Any insight on that?
No, it's a real question mark right now. I have heard different things from different people, most of which amount to we don't know. I think the big thing we're looking to see is how the Congressional Budget Office sets the Farm Bill baseline, which will come out at the beginning of next year. And that's really going to determine like how IRA funds play into the farm bill. But short answer, no, I don't know right now.
Okay. And then we have another question from Michael. Can you talk about the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Initiative? Michael, I believe you're talking about or Harry, if you know, go ahead.
Well, no, sorry, you go first.
Oh.
Let me make sure I'm right.
I was going to say, are you talking about the state's partnership initiative that was just came out this past year? Sorry, I don't know. You just want to put in the chat.
I'll start talking,
Okay.
assuming that is what you're talking about, Michael. So that money is it's $22.5 million, if I remember correctly, of which is split between EQIP, CSP, and ASEP, I think. And so that partnership or that initiative is really utilizing existing funds. And so hopefully with some of this IRA money, with ideally increased farm bill money, there would be an opportunity to again allocate those EQIP, CSP, and ASEP funds to the Chesapeake Bay region.
Okay, and then other question, are there incentives for food shed localization?
Yes, that is not in the conservation title. It'd probably be in the specialty crop title, but there are some incentives in the farm bill around food hubs, I know. I'm not 100% sure, but I would point you to the Congressional Research Service.
Okay, so those are all the questions that we have. Thank you, Harry, so much for your presentation. That was really great. I just want to close this webinar saying thank you all for joining us today. Please feel free to reach out to Harry with any questions. You can see his email address is right there, and I'll follow up in an email with the webinar recording as well as his email address. And like Harry said, we will be having further discussions around the Farm Bill so we can share our 2023 Farm Bill priorities during our lobby day next year, hopefully in early March. And we will be utilizing our upcoming ag work group meetings as well as our state calls that happen monthly to discuss these priorities. We have already begun some of these discussions in our ag work group calls, but we're going to build upon them. And so if you have any questions or if you have strong feelings about our priorities, please feel free to reach out to me. And again, thank you for attending and hope you had a great time and have a great rest of your day. And happy 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act.